She was 18 years old, standing in a county clerk's office with dirt under her fingernails and $17 to her name, holding a deed that 3 different men had already called worthless. The land was called Iron Hollow Ridge, 60 acres of rock, scrub pine, and a cave that locals swore would be her grave. Every merchant in town told her to tear up that paper and buy a train ticket east. Every rancher said she wouldn't last until the first frost. But Brenna Whitlock didn't come here to listen to men who'd never gone hungry. She came here to survive. If you want to find out what happens when the entire frontier bets against one girl and loses, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels, and follow along, because this one's going to stay with you. The morning Brenna Whitlock left home for the last time, her father didn't come downstairs. She heard him moving around up there. The creak of the floorboards, the scrape of his chair against the wall. But the bedroom door stayed shut. Her stepmother, Doris, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at the spot on the wall where the good clock used to hang before they'd sold it. "You've got everything?" Doris asked without looking up. "Everything I need." "That's not what I asked." Brenna set her pack on the floor near the door. It was a canvas rucksack she'd stitched together from 2 feed sacks, and it held everything she owned in the world. 1 change of clothes, a wool blanket with a cigarette burn near the hem, a hunting knife her grandmother had given her when she was 12, a tin cup, a pouch of dried venison, a handful of nails she'd pulled from the barn wall, and the deed. The deed was the thing that had started all of it. "He's not coming down," Doris said quietly. She finally looked at Brenna, and there was something complicated in her face. Not quite guilt, not quite relief. Something in between that neither of them had a word for. "You know that." "I know." "He wanted to. He just—" "I said, I know, Doris." The kitchen went quiet. Outside, a rooster that should have been sold weeks ago crowed at the gray sky. The Whitlock farm, what was left of it, sat on 40 acres of played-out soil east of Harlan Falls, and the recession had chewed through it the way fire chews through dry grass. First, the cattle prices dropped. Then the general store stopped extending credit. Then Brenna's father, Wallace Whitlock, started drinking the kind of drinking that doesn't stop at sundown, and Doris started doing the math that wives do when the numbers quit adding up. 3 months ago, Doris had sat Brenna down at this same table and laid it out plain. There wasn't enough. Not enough money, not enough food, not enough of anything to carry 3 people through winter. Wallace had 2 younger children with Doris, Harold, who was 7, and little Bess, who was 4, and those kids had to eat. Brenna was 18. Brenna was old enough. Doris hadn't said you need to leave. She'd said, we need to figure something out, which meant the same thing, and both of them knew it. So Brenna had gone through her grandmother's old trunk in the attic, the one nobody had touched since Nana Maeve died 6 years back. And she'd found the deed folded inside a hymnal. 60 acres in a place called Iron Hollow Ridge, way out past the Saddler Creek watershed, up where the timber country broke apart into rock and scrub. Nana Maeve had won it in a card game 30 years ago, or inherited it from some cousin nobody remembered, or gotten it as payment for a debt. The story changed depending on who told it. What didn't change was the fact that nobody had ever done a thing with it. Brenna had taken the deed to the county clerk's office in Harlan Falls to make sure it was real. The clerk, a man named Poole, with reading glasses held together by wire, had studied it for 10 minutes and then looked at her like she'd handed him a dead fish. "It's legitimate," he'd said. "But I wouldn't get excited, miss. Iron Hollow Ridge is 60 acres of the worst ground in the county. There's nothing up there but rock and rattlesnakes. Is it mine or not? If you're Maeve Callister's granddaughter and this deed is properly witnessed, which it appears to be, then yes, it's yours." He'd paused, taken off his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose, for whatever that's worth. Now Brenna stood in her father's kitchen with the deed in her pack and nowhere else to go. She picked up the rucksack and slung it over her shoulder. It was heavier than it looked, which was something, at least. "I left the egg money in the jar on the shelf," she told Doris. 11 cents, and there's a snare line I set down by the creek that should have something in it by tomorrow." Doris opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "Brenna, that land, people say there's nothing out there, Just rocks and some old cave. People say a lot of things. You don't even have a horse. I've got feet. Doris stood up from the table. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, pulled open a drawer, and took out a folded cloth. Inside were 4 silver dollars and a handful of smaller coins. She held them out without a word. That's yours, Brenna said. It's mine to give. Take it. Brenna looked at the money. She looked at Doris. The woman was 32 years old and already had the drawn face of someone twice that age. Her hands were chapped raw from lye soap and winter water. She'd married Wallace Whitlock knowing he was a widower with a half-grown daughter, and she'd done her best with what she got, and Brenna had never hated her for any of it. Half, Brenna said. All of it. Half, Doris. You've got kids to feed. They looked at each other for a long moment. 2 women standing on opposite sides of a problem that neither of them had created, and then Doris peeled off 2 of the silver dollars and put the rest back in the cloth. She pressed the coins into Brenna's hand. You're stubborn as your grandmother, Doris said. Good. She lived to 74. Brenna put the coins in her pocket, adjusted her pack, and walked out the door without looking back at the stairs. If her father had something to say, he'd had 18 years to say it. The road to Harlan Falls was 6 miles of frozen mud and wheel ruts. Brenna walked it in boots that were 2 sizes too big. They'd been her father's before his feet swelled up from the drinking, and by the time she hit the outskirts of town, her heels were raw and bleeding. She ignored it the way she'd learned to ignore most pain, by thinking about something else. Harlan Falls was a town that had seen better days and knew it. Half the storefronts on Main Street were shuttered. The bank had a line out the door every morning. Not people depositing money, but people trying to get what was left of theirs before the whole thing went sideways. The saloon was the only business that seemed to be thriving, which told you everything you needed to know about the state of things. Brenna walked past all of it and headed straight for Greer's Supply, the only general store still open on the west end of town. The bell above the door jingled when she walked in, and old Tom Greer looked up from behind the counter where he was reading a week-old newspaper. Morning, he said. Then he saw the pack on her back and the look on her face, and his expression shifted. You heading somewhere, Whitlock? Iron Hollow Ridge. Tom Greer set down his newspaper. He was a lean, weathered man in his 60s, with a white mustache stained yellow at the corners from pipe tobacco. He'd known Brenna since she was a girl buying penny candy with coins she'd earned picking rocks out of Haskell's field. Iron Hollow, he repeated. That's right. By yourself. Unless you're volunteering to come with me. He didn't laugh. She'd expected him to laugh, and the fact that he didn't made something tighten in her chest. Brenna, he said, leaning forward on the counter, I knew your grandmother. Maeve was tough as boiled leather, and even she never set foot on that land. You know why? Because there's nothing there. 60 acres of shale and pine scrub, and a cave that goes back into the ridge so far, nobody's ever found the end of it. You can't farm shale, you can't graze cattle on rock. I'm not planning to farm shale. Then what exactly are you planning? She set her pack onto the counter. I need a hand axe, a coil of rope, 20 feet if you've got it, a bag of cornmeal, salt pork, and whatever seed potatoes you have left. And I need it for $7. Tom looked at her for a long time. She could see him doing the arithmetic in his head. Not just the money, but the other math. The math of an 18-year-old girl walking into wilderness with no horse, no wagon, no help, and winter coming on like a freight train. $7 won't cover all that, he said. What will it cover? He sighed. He got up from his stool and started pulling things off shelves, setting them on the counter one at a time. A hand axe with a hickory handle. A coil of rope, not 20 feet, but close enough. A 5-pound sack of cornmeal. A smaller sack of salt. No salt pork. He was out. But a jar of rendered lard that would keep. And from a bin near the back, a dozen seed potatoes that were already starting to sprout eyes. $9.40, he said. But I'll do it for $7 if you promise me something. What? If it doesn't work out up there, if the land's no good and the winter's too hard, you come back. You come back here and I'll find you work. Sweeping floors, stocking shelves, something. You don't have to die on that ridge just to prove a point. Brenna counted out $7 onto the counter. Her hands were steady. I appreciate that, Mr. Greer, I really do. But I'm not coming back. She packed the supplies into her rucksack, which was now so heavy she had to lean forward to keep her balance, and walked out of the store. Tom Greer watched her go through the front window, shaking his head slowly, and then went back to his newspaper. Brenna was halfway down Main Street when she heard someone call her name. "Hey, Whitlock girl!" She turned. A man was leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon. Clyde Burrell, a cattle rancher who owned about 1,000 acres of good grazing land south of town. He was 40-something, thick through the chest and belly, with a red face and small eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. "Word is you're heading up to Iron Hollow," Burrell said. He had 2 other men with him, ranch hands by the look of them, and all 3 were grinning. "Word travels fast," Brenna said. "Small town." Burrell pushed off the hitching post and took a step toward her. "Listen, I'll save you the trouble. That land your granny left you? I'll give you $15 for it right now, cash money." $15. More than she had in her pocket, enough to buy a train ticket somewhere, Denver maybe, or Kansas City, and start over in a place where nobody knew her name. "It's not for sale," she said. Burrell laughed. Not a mean laugh, exactly, but the kind of laugh a man gives when he thinks he's being patient with someone who doesn't understand how the world works. "Girl, I've been ranching this county for 20 years. I know every acre of ground between here and the territorial line. Iron Hollow Ridge is a rock pile with a hole in it. You can't grow anything. You can't run stock. The only thing that piece of land is good for is keeping the wind company." "Then why do you want to buy it?" The question caught him off guard. His grin flickered just for a second and then came back wider than before. "Because I'm a generous man, and because I'd hate to see a young lady freeze to death over a piece of paper. I'll take my chances." She turned and kept walking. Behind her, she heard one of the ranch hands say something she couldn't quite make out, and all 3 of them laughed. Brenna's face burned, but she didn't stop and she didn't look back. The road out of Harlan Falls climbed steadily northwest, following the creek bed through stands of pine and aspen that grew thinner and more stunted the higher she went. By midday, the last homesteads had fallen behind her, and the country opened up into a raw, wind-scraped landscape of ridgeline and exposed rock. She stopped to eat around noon, a handful of cornmeal mixed with water from the creek, eaten cold because she didn't want to waste time building a fire. Her feet were a mess. She'd stuffed rags into the toes of her father's boots to make them fit better, but the rags had shifted and bunched, and now she had blisters on top of blisters. She pulled off the boots, wrung out the bloody rags, repacked them as best she could, and kept moving. The afternoon was worse. The trail, if you could call it a trail, petered out into nothing about 3 miles past the last homestead, and from there it was just Brenna and the ridge, fighting through deadfall and loose shale that shifted and slid under her feet like the ground itself was trying to throw her off. By late afternoon, she was lost. Not completely lost. She could still see the ridge up ahead, that long, dark spine of rock cutting across the sky like the back of some enormous sleeping animal. But the approach she'd planned, following the creek up through the timber, had dead-ended in a tangle of fallen pines and boulders the size of houses. She spent an hour trying to find a way through, failed, backtracked, tried another route, and found herself standing on a bare slab of rock with the sun dropping fast and no clear path in any direction. She sat down on the rock and pressed her hands against her face. Her shoulders were aching, her feet were on fire. The rucksack felt like it was full of anvils. "Stupid," she whispered. "Stupid, stupid, stupid." She sat there for maybe 5 minutes, letting herself feel all of it. The fear, the exhaustion, the creeping suspicion that every single person who'd told her this was a bad idea had been right. She let it wash over her the way cold water washes over river stones, and then she stood up, shrugged the pack back onto her shoulders, and looked at the ridge again. The ridge. That was the landmark. Everything else could change, but the ridge was where she was going, and the ridge wasn't going anywhere. She found a game trail about 30 yards to the south, a narrow track worn into the scrub by deer or elk, and followed it upward through the last stretch of timber. The light was failing fast, the sky going from steel gray to a deep, bruised purple, and she was beginning to think she'd have to spend the night in the open when the trail curved around a massive outcrop of granite and the ground dropped away into a shallow bowl. And there it was, Iron Hollow Ridge, her land. Even in the dying light, she could see why nobody wanted it. The bowl was maybe 200 yards across, ringed on 3 sides by walls of gray shale and pine scrub. The floor of the bowl was rocky, broken by patches of coarse grass and a few scraggly aspens that looked like they'd been fighting for their lives since the day they sprouted. On the far side, where the ridge wall rose up steep and dark, she could see the mouth of the cave, a wide, low opening in the rock face, black as a missing tooth. It looked like the loneliest place on earth. Brenna dropped her pack at the edge of the bowl and stood there, breathing hard, staring at the cave mouth across the clearing. A cold wind was coming down off the ridge, carrying the smell of pine and frost and something deeper, rock and earth, and old, still air. The smell of a place that had been waiting a long time for someone to show up. "Well," she said out loud, because there was nobody else to say it to. "Here we are." She made camp that night at the cave's entrance, too exhausted to go any deeper inside. She built a small fire from dead pine branches and heated water in her tin cup, mixing it with cornmeal to make a thin porridge that tasted like nothing but filled her stomach enough to quiet the growling. She spread her blanket on the rock floor and lay down with the fire between her and the cave mouth, watching the sparks drift up toward the overhang. The sounds were different here. No roosters, no creaking farmhouse, no distant barking dogs. Just the wind moving through the pines, the occasional pop of the fire, and from somewhere deep in the cave behind her, a steady dripping sound. Water on stone. Regular as a heartbeat. She was asleep in minutes. Morning came cold and bright. Brenna woke with every muscle in her body screaming and her blanket dusted with frost. She lay still for a minute, staring at the pale sky visible beyond the cave's overhang, and then forced herself upright. The first thing she did was explore the cave. She'd brought a stub of candle. She'd forgotten about it until now, found it wedged into the bottom corner of her pack. And she lit it and held it up as she moved past the entrance into the dark. The cave was bigger than she'd expected. The entrance was wide but low, maybe 5 feet tall, so she had to duck to get through. But once she was past the first 10 feet, the ceiling rose up sharply, and the passage opened into a chamber that was, she paced it off later, roughly 40 feet wide and 60 feet deep, with a ceiling high enough that her candlelight couldn't reach it. The floor was smooth stone, mostly dry except for a section along the left wall where water seeped down from somewhere above, running in thin streams over the rock face and collecting in a natural basin about the size of a bathtub. Brenna dipped her finger in and tasted it. Clean, cold. No mineral taste, no sulfur, just water. She stood in the middle of the chamber and held out her hand, palm up, the way her grandmother had taught her to feel for drafts. The air was still. Not dead still. There was a faint movement, a breath almost, coming from deeper in the cave. But the temperature was noticeably different from outside. Warmer, steady. The kind of warmth that comes from deep rock, from the earth itself holding on to heat the way a cast iron stove holds it long after the fire goes out. She spent the next hour going deeper, moving carefully, testing each step before she committed her weight. The cave narrowed into a series of smaller passages that branched off in different directions, some of them too tight to squeeze through, others opening into smaller chambers. In one of these, about 100 feet from the main entrance, she found something that made her stop and stare. The floor was covered in a thick layer of bat guano, dried, crumbling, dark as coffee grounds. Inches of it. Maybe a foot deep in places. Most people would have gagged and backed away. Brenna crouched down and picked up a handful. She rubbed it between her fingers, smelled it, let it crumble back to the floor. "Fertilizer," she said to the empty cave. "That's fertilizer." Her grandmother had kept a garden that was the envy of 3 counties. Nanomave's tomatoes were legendary, and one of the secrets she'd shared with Brenna years ago was that bat guano was the richest natural fertilizer you could find. Better than horse manure, better than compost, packed with nitrogen and phosphorus and everything a plant needed to grow fast and strong. Brenna sat back on her heels in the dark, holding her stub of candle, surrounded by bat droppings, and started to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh, exactly. It was the kind of laugh that comes when you've been walking through the dark for a long time and someone lights a match. It was relief and surprise and a wild, reckless kind of hope, all mixed together. And it echoed off the cave walls and came back to her sounding almost like someone else's voice. She made herself stop. She made herself think. The cave had water. It had stable temperature. It had fertilizer. And the main chamber, that big open room near the entrance, had a floor that was above the water line, dry, protected from wind, and insulated by thousands of tons of rock on every side. The men in Harlan Falls had looked at this place and seen a hole in the ground. A tomb, Clyde Burrell had probably called it when he was talking to his ranch hands over whiskey. A death trap. Brenna looked at it and saw a foundation. She spent the rest of that first day taking inventory. She walked the perimeter of the bowl, noting where the sun hit the ground at different times of day, where the wind was blocked by the ridge wall, where the soil, thin as it was, seemed deepest. She found a stand of straight-trunked pines on the north slope that would make decent building timber. She found a seep spring about 100 yards east of the cave that fed a small, clear pool before disappearing back into the rock. She found deer tracks and rabbit droppings, and the scratched-up base of a tree where a bear had been sharpening its claws, which was less encouraging but at least meant there was wildlife in the area. By the time the sun went down, she had a plan. Not a good plan. Not a complete plan. But a plan. She would build a cabin against the cave mouth, not inside it, but butted right up to it, so the cave served as the back wall and the interior rooms of the structure. The cabin would be the front face, the part that dealt with weather. The cave would be the pantry, the root cellar, the water source, and in the worst of winter, the last line of defense against cold. She would dig garden beds inside the cave's main chamber, mixing the bat guano with whatever topsoil she could scrape together from the bowl, and grow food underground where frost couldn't touch it. She would build pens for animals, chickens first, then maybe a goat if she could trade for one, using the smaller cave passages as natural shelter. It was insane. She knew it was insane. A single woman, alone, with no experience building anything bigger than a chicken coop, planning to construct a homestead in the middle of nowhere before winter hit. But what was the alternative? Go back to Harlan Falls and sweep Tom Greer's floors? Sell the land to Clyde Burrell for $15 and ride a train to some city where she'd end up working in a factory until her lungs gave out? No. She'd rather fail here than succeed at being small somewhere else. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of Brenna's life, and she'd had some hard ones. She started with the timber. Using the hand axe Tom Greer had sold her, she felled pines one at a time, working from dawn until the light gave out. The axe was sharp but small, meant for splitting kindling, not dropping trees, and each trunk took her the better part of an hour. She'd chop until her arms shook, rest for 5 minutes, and then chop some more. The blisters on her hands broke and bled and then broke again, and she wrapped them in strips torn from her spare shirt and kept going. She dragged the logs one at a time down the slope to the bowl, using the rope to rig a crude harness over her shoulders. Each log weighed more than she did. By the end of the first week, she had 12 logs stacked near the cave mouth, and she'd lost enough weight that her trousers wouldn't stay up without a piece of rope cinched around her waist. She ate sparingly. Cornmeal porridge in the morning, dried venison at midday if she had the time to stop. Cornmeal again at night, sometimes with wild greens she recognized from her grandmother's teaching. Dandelion, wood sorrel, young cattail shoots from the edge of the seep spring. She set snare lines along the game trails and caught 2 rabbits in the first week, which she skinned and smoked over her fire, saving every scrap of meat and using the hides for patching her gloves. The cabin went up slowly. She notched the logs by hand, fitting them together the way she'd seen it done at barn raisings when she was a girl, but without the dozen strong men who normally did the heavy lifting. She couldn't raise the wall logs alone. They were too heavy. So she invented a system using her rope and a fulcrum made from a forked branch jammed into the ground. She'd lever one end of the log up, brace it, lever the other end, brace that, and work her way up inch by inch until the log was sitting in its notch. It was agonizingly slow. It was also the only option she had. The walls were rough. The notches didn't always fit tight. Gaps showed between the logs where cold air would pour through, and she knew she'd have to chink every one of them with mud and moss before the temperature dropped. The fireplace was worse. She'd never built one before, and her first attempt collapsed the moment she tried to light a fire in it. She tore it apart, studied the rubble, and started over, this time using the flattest stone she could find along the creek bed, stacking them carefully and packing the joints with clay she'd dug from a seam near the seep spring. The second attempt held. Barely. The chimney drew badly and filled the cabin with smoke for the first hour, but eventually something shifted in the draft and the smoke began to rise. Brenna sat on the floor of her half-built cabin with tears running down her face. From the smoke, she told herself, and watched the fire burn. She was sitting there feeding sticks into the flames when she heard the sound of hooves outside. She grabbed the knife from her belt and went to the cabin's open doorway. She hadn't hung a door yet, and looked out into the late afternoon light. A man on a mule was picking his way down the slope into the bowl. He was old, somewhere past 60, with a long gray beard and a battered hat pulled low over his eyes. He rode the mule the way a man rides an animal he's been sitting on for 30 years, loose and easy, his body moving with the animal's gait like they were one creature. He pulled up about 20 yards from the cabin and looked at it. Then he looked at Brenna. Then he looked at the cabin again. "Huh," he said. "Can I help you?" Brenna asked. Her hand was still on the knife. "Name's Emmett Slade. I trap up along the North Fork." He shifted in his saddle and spat off to one side. "Heard somebody was up here trying to build something, didn't believe it. Now you've seen it." "I have." He studied the cabin with the appraising eye of a man who'd built a few structures in his time. "Your notching's off on that southwest corner. You don't fix it, the whole wall's going to rack when the ground freezes and shifts." Brenna looked at the corner he was pointing to. She'd known something was wrong with it. The logs didn't sit quite flush, but she hadn't been able to figure out what. "What do I do about it?" she asked. "You need to pull that top log, recut the notch about an inch deeper on the downhill side, and set it again. Otherwise the weight's going to push out instead of down, and you'll wake up one morning with your wall in your lap." She stared at him. "You came all the way out here to tell me that?" Emmett Slade looked at her from under the brim of his hat, and for the first time she noticed his eyes, pale blue, sharp, not unkind. "I came out here because I was curious. Telling you about the notch is just being neighborly." He paused. "You're Maeve Callister's granddaughter." It wasn't a question. "You knew her?" "Everybody knew Maeve. Toughest woman I ever met, and I'm including my first wife, who once pulled a mule out of a sinkhole by herself." He looked around the bowl again. The stacked logs, the crude fireplace, the beginnings of a life where no life had any business being. "She'd have liked what you're doing here. Most people think I'm crazy. Most people are idiots." He turned the mule's head. "I'll be back through in a couple weeks. If you're still alive, I'll show you how to set a proper ridgepole." He rode back up the slope and disappeared into the trees without another word. Brenna stood in her doorway, watching the spot where he'd been, and felt something she hadn't felt since she'd left her father's house. Not hope exactly, something quieter than that, something like being seen. She fixed the notch the next morning. Emmett was right. The top log had been sitting wrong, pushing outward instead of settling into the wall. She pulled it down, recut the joint with her hand axe, fighting the wood for 2 hours until the angle was right, and set it back in place. This time it locked tight. When she pushed against the wall with both hands, nothing moved. 2 days later, she started on the garden beds inside the cave. She hauled bucket after bucket of bat guano from the deeper passages, mixing it with topsoil she scraped from the few patches of earth in the bowl, and spread the mixture into raised beds she'd framed with flat stones along the cave's main chamber. The work was filthy and backbreaking. The guano stank, and no matter how many times she washed her hands in the seep spring, the smell clung to her skin like a second layer of dirt. But when she pressed the seed potatoes into the dark, rich soil and watered them from the natural basin, something in her chest unlocked. This was real. This was something growing. The days blurred together. She finished the cabin walls. She hung a door made from split logs lashed together with strips of rawhide. She chinked the gaps with mud and moss, working her fingers into every crack until the wind stopped whistling through. She built a crude bed frame from pine poles and stretched her blanket over it. And for the first time in weeks, she slept off the ground. She was not, she knew, building anything beautiful. The cabin was squat and rough-looking, with walls that weren't quite plumb and a roof line that sagged slightly on the east side. The door didn't close all the way. There was a 2-inch gap at the bottom that she stuffed with rags, and the fireplace still smoked when the wind came from the north. Inside, the cave's mouth gaped dark and cool behind the cabin's back wall, a constant reminder that she was living on the edge of something vast and unknown. But it was hers. Every crooked log, every badly chinked gap, every stone in that temperamental fireplace. She had put it there with her own 2 hands, and nobody could take that away from her. Late one evening, as she sat outside the cabin eating the last of a rabbit she'd snared that morning, she heard the sound she'd been dreading. Hooves again. But this time more than one horse. 3 riders came down the slope into the bowl. Even in the fading light, Brenna recognized the one in front. Clyde Burrell sat his horse like a man who owned everything he could see, and the way he looked around the bowl, her land, made something cold settle in Brenna's stomach. "Well, well," Burrell said. "She's still here." Brenna stood up. She wiped her hands on her trousers and didn't reach for her knife because there were 3 of them and one of her, and a knife wouldn't change those odds. "Mr. Burrell?" "Miss Whitlock." He swung down from his horse and walked toward the cabin, studying it the way you'd study a curiosity at a county fair. "You've been busy." "I have. Built yourself a little shack against a cave." He touched the wall with one hand, pressing against it. The logs held. Something flickered across his face. "And what exactly is the long-term plan here? You going to spend the winter eating rocks?" "I'm going to spend the winter on my own land, in my own cabin, eating food I grew myself." One of the ranch hands snickered. Burrell silenced him with a look. "Brenna." His voice dropped, went softer, almost paternal. "I'm not your enemy. I'm a practical man offering you a practical solution. I'll give you $20 for this land. That's 5 more than I offered last time, and it's 5 more than anyone else in this county would give you." "Why do you want it?" There it was again. That flicker. That half second where the mask slipped and something colder showed through. "I told you, I'm a generous—" "You're not generous, Mr. Burrell. I've lived in this county my whole life, and I've never seen you give anyone anything without getting something back. So I'll ask you again. Why do you want this land?" The silence stretched out between them. One of the horses stamped and blew. A bird called from somewhere in the pines. "Because it connects my north range to the timberline," Burrell said finally. "And because I don't like gaps in my holdings. That's all." It was the truth, or part of it, and they both knew it. But there was something else behind his eyes, something calculating and patient and not quite honest, and Brenna filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things she didn't understand yet, but might need later. "It's not for sale," she said. "Not for $20. Not for $100. This is my land, Mr. Burrell, and I intend to stay on it." Burrell looked at her. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the cave mouth behind it, dark and gaping. Then he put his hat back on and walked to his horse. "It's going to be a hard winter," he said as he swung up into the saddle. "The old-timers are saying it'll be the worst in 20 years. You think about that, sitting in your little cave when the snow's piled up to the roofline and you're down to your last handful of cornmeal." He gathered his reins. "My offer stands, for now." He turned his horse and rode out of the bowl, his men following behind him. Brenna watched them go, and she stood there in the dark for a long time after the sound of hooves had faded, listening to the wind and the dripping water and the beating of her own stubborn heart. She went inside, barred the door, and fed the fire until the cabin was warm enough to stop shivering. Then she sat on her bed and pulled the deed from her pack, unfolding it carefully in the firelight. 60 acres. Her name. A place in the world that belonged to her and no one else. She folded the deed again and put it back in the pack. Then she lay down, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. Outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, thin and lonesome, the sound of something small and alone calling out to a sky that never answered back. Brenna slept anyway. Emmett Slade came back 3 weeks later, as promised, riding the same mule with the same battered hat and the same expression of a man who'd seen enough of the world to be surprised by very little of it. He came down the slope into the bowl and stopped at the edge of the clearing, and this time he sat there for a long minute before he said anything. The cabin had changed. The door fit flush in the frame now. The chimney stack rose straight above the roofline, capped with a flat stone to keep the rain out, and it was drawing right. Brenna could tell because the smoke rose clean and vertical in the still morning air instead of drifting back in through the gaps. She'd chinked every crack in the walls with a mixture of mud, dried grass, and pine pitch, and the exterior had that sealed, settled look of a structure that intended to stay where it was put. Against the cave mouth behind it, the cabin sat like a single deliberate sentence at the end of a long argument. Emmett pushed his hat up and scratched the back of his head. "Ridgepole's still a little low on the east end," he said. "I know. I couldn't get enough lift on that side alone. I shimmed it as best I could." He swung off the mule and looped the reins over a pine branch. "Show me inside." She showed him inside. He walked the cabin slowly, ducking under the low door frame, and stood in the main room with his hands on his hips. The fireplace was burning. The floor was packed dirt, but swept clean. Along the back wall, where the cave mouth opened up, she'd hung a piece of canvas she'd traded her spare blanket for at a trapper's camp 2 weeks ago. And behind that canvas, out of the wind, were her supplies. The cornmeal, what was left of it, her tools, the rope, and the row of clay pots she'd made by hand from the seep spring clay, fired in the fireplace until they were hard enough to hold water. "You made those," Emmett said, pointing at the pots. "My grandmother taught me. Took me 4 tries to get the clay mix right. The first 3 cracked when I fired them." "What happened to the pieces?" "I ground them up and used them in the mortar for the fireplace." He looked at her for a moment. "Smart. Practical. Same thing out here." He pulled back the canvas and looked into the cave beyond. Brenna brought him the stub of a new candle. She'd rendered the tallow herself from the rabbit fat she'd been saving, and he held it up and walked into the main chamber. She followed him in. He moved slowly, the way he did everything, letting his eyes travel over the ceiling, the walls, the water seeping down the left side. He put his hand flat against the stone and held it there. "Steady," he said. "Warmer than outside by a good 10 degrees, I'd say. 11.5. I made a thermometer." He turned and looked at her. "The county clerk has one in his office window," she said. "I measured it against his before I left town, and then I made my own out of a piece of glass tubing from a broken lamp and some alcohol dyed with crushed elderberries. It's not exact, but it's close enough." Emmett was quiet for a moment. Then he turned back to the cave and kept walking. He found the garden beds along the left wall. 8 of them now, framed in stone, filled with the dark, rich mixture of bat guano and topsoil, and in 6 of them, a visible push of green growth reaching up toward the candles Brenna kept burning in rotation to give the plants light. He crouched down next to the nearest bed and pressed his thumb into the soil. It gave the way good garden soil gives, some, not stiff, not sloppy, but deep and alive. "Potatoes," Brenna said. "And some wild garlic I found on the south slope, transplanted. And there," she pointed to the beds at the end, "I put in some cattail root sections from the spring pool. They'll spread if I let them, but they're edible all the way down to the tuber." "You know about cattail root?" "My grandmother did. I paid attention." Emmett stood up slowly. He looked at the garden beds. He looked at the cave ceiling above them. He looked at the water basin and the constant, quiet drip of moisture down the rock face. "How long have you had green shoots?" 12 days for the potatoes, 10 for the garlic." In winter. The temperature stays consistent enough, no frost, enough moisture from the seeping. I'm still working out the light situation. I don't have enough candles to keep all 8 beds lit for the hours they need, so I rotate the light to the beds that are furthest along and let the others rest." Emmett walked back out through the canvas into the cabin. He stood by the fire and held his hands out toward the heat, not because he was cold, Brenna thought, but because he needed a moment to think. She'd noticed he was like that, a man who used physical tasks as cover for mental ones. "You know," he said finally, "I've been trapping up and down this ridge for 15 years. I've looked at this cave a dozen times. And I saw a hole in a rock." He looked at her over his shoulder. "You saw a house." "I saw what I needed to see." He made a sound that might have been a laugh and turned back to the fire. "What else do you need?" "Animals. I can feed myself if the garden holds, but I need a protein source that doesn't depend on snare lines. Chickens, ideally. Maybe a goat by spring." She paused. "And I could use another axe. My handle's starting to split. I've got a spare axe at the cabin. I'll bring it next time." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the floor. "There's a widow woman in Harlan Falls, name of Pruitt, Helen Pruitt. She keeps laying hens. Tell her Emmett sent you and she'll trade fair." "I don't have much to trade." "You've got those clay pots. Helen lost most of her cookware in a cellar flood last month. She'd probably give you 3 hens for a good pot." Brenna thought about it. The pots had taken her a week each to make right. But chickens would lay eggs all winter, and eggs were protein, and protein kept you thinking straight when everything else went wrong. "I'll go next week," she said. Emmett put on his hat. "One more thing." He said it like an afterthought, but his voice had shifted slightly. Gone careful in the way voices go when people are getting to the thing they actually came to say. I ran into Clyde Burrell coming down off the North Ridge 2 days ago. He was up near the boundary line, the one that borders your East 40. Brenna went still. What was he doing up there? I didn't ask. Didn't have to. He had a surveyor's kit on his pack horse. Emmett met her eyes. Now that could mean a lot of things. Could mean he's checking his own lines, which he does regular enough. But the way he was looking at your ridge, he stopped and shook his head. I don't know the man's business. I just know what I saw. After Emmett left, Brenna went to her pack and took out the deed. She spread it on the floor in the firelight and studied the property description. The chains and links and compass bearings that defined the boundaries of her 60 acres. She'd read it 20 times already, but now she read it again, more slowly, paying attention to the eastern boundary where it followed along the base of the ridge. Something nagged at her, not in the deed itself. The language seemed plain enough, but in the way Burrell kept coming back, the offer he'd made, the way he'd looked at the cave. She folded the deed back up, put it away, and went to work. The trip to Harlan Falls took her a full day on foot and most of a day back. She arrived in town on a Tuesday morning with 2 clay pots wrapped in canvas in her pack and the look of someone who'd slept outside the night before because the town was too far to make in one day, which was exactly what she'd done. Helen Pruitt turned out to be a small, precise woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and flour on her apron who looked Brenna over from the doorstep of her place on the south edge of town the way a good livestock buyer looks over a horse, quickly, thoroughly, making assessments she didn't bother to share. Emmett said you might come, Helen said. He sent a message with the Patterson boy. I've got 2 clay pots, good ones. Thick walls, won't crack if you heat them gradual. Brenna set one of them on Helen's porch railing. I need laying hens. Helen picked up the pot. She tapped it with her knuckle, listening to the ring of it. She turned it over and looked at the bottom. She ran her thumb along the rim. This your work? Yes. Where'd you learn? My grandmother. Where's the second pot? Brenna set it on the railing. Helen examined it with the same thoroughness, and then she set it down and wiped her hands on her apron. 5 hens, she said. 5? For 2 pots? 3 of them are older. They'll still lay, but not as heavy as the young ones. You take 3 older and 2 young, and that's a fair trade. Brenna thought about it for about 2 seconds. Done. Helen went around to the hen house. While she was gone, one of the town women, Brenna didn't know her name, a round-faced woman with a market basket, stopped on the street and stared up at her on the porch. Aren't you the Whitlock girl? The one who went out to Iron Hollow? That's right. The woman's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise, doubt, something approaching pity. You're still alive. Appears so. But that land, there's nothing out there. My husband said, your husband's never been there. The woman blinked. Well, no, but then with respect, ma'am, I'm not sure what he knows about it. The woman snapped her mouth shut, turned on her heel, and walked away. Helen came back around the corner of the house with a wooden crate containing 5 indignant chickens, caught the tail end of the exchange, and looked at Brenna with something that might have been approval. That was Marge Calloway, Helen said. Her husband's been telling everyone you'll be dead before Christmas. I'll try to disappoint him. Helen handed over the crate. The chickens objected loudly to the transfer. You need anything else while you're in town? Nails, if you have any, and lamp oil if you can spare it. I can spare a pint of oil. No nails. Sorry. She looked at Brenna. You're building something up there. Trying to? What? Brenna adjusted the crate on her hip. The chickens jostled and clucked. Something that'll last, she said. She walked out of Harlan Falls with 5 chickens in a crate and a pint of lamp oil in her pack, and she felt eyes on her the whole length of Main Street. She kept her chin up and her pace steady, and she didn't look at anyone until she was past the last building and on the road north. The walk back was harder with the crate. The chickens, who had apparently decided that Brenna was personally responsible for every injustice that had ever been done to them, complained at volume for the first 4 miles and then subsided into a sullen, jostling silence. By the time she reached the trail into the hollow, Brenna's arm was numb and her shoulder ached from the weight, and she was talking to the chickens mostly to keep herself company. I'm going to build you the nicest house you've ever had, she told them. You're going to have a whole side passage in the cave, constant temperature, no foxes. She shifted the crate to her other hip. All I ask in return is eggs. That's not unreasonable." One of the older hens made a sound that conveyed deep skepticism. "I know," Brenna said. "Fair enough." She got home just before dark and built the coop that night by lantern light, a framed pen of pine poles at the mouth of one of the narrower side passages in the cave, with a gate she could close and open. She bedded the floor with dried pine needles and pine shavings she'd been collecting, scattered a handful of dried cattail seeds she'd pounded into a rough grain, and put the chickens in. She found the first egg the next morning. It was small, one of the younger hens, and still warm when she picked it up. She stood in the cave holding it in both hands like it was something fragile and important, which it was, both of those things, and she felt a feeling she couldn't quite name. Not just relief. Something older than that. Something that had to do with living things going on, living regardless of what winter said about it. She hard-boiled the egg and ate it slowly, sitting by the fire, making it last. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that was brutal in its demands, but also, in a way she hadn't expected, steady. She was up before light every morning, feeding the fire before it went fully cold, checking the chickens, checking the garden, eating whatever was ready. By the time the sky went gray outside the cabin door, she was already working. She built the livestock shelter, a lean-to of poles and pine branches tucked into the most sheltered corner of the bowl, backed against the ridge wall where the rock blocked the north wind. She wasn't sure what she'd use it for yet. A goat, eventually. Maybe more chickens. She built it anyway because having the structure ready was better than needing it and not having it. She extended the garden beds. She had 8 running now, and she added 4 more along the right wall of the main chamber, using the last of her bat guano stores mixed with sedge grass she'd pulled from the edge of the seep pool, and let compost in a pile for 3 weeks. The new beds went in slower than the first 8, because she was doing it all between other tasks, fitting the work into the gaps in her day the way you fit stones into a wall. She found a second bat colony, deeper in the cave. She'd been careful not to disturb them, knowing that as long as they were roosting there, they'd keep producing the fertilizer she needed. She marked the passage to their chamber and left it alone. One afternoon, in mid-November, she was out on the south slope cutting deadfall when she heard voices below the ridge. 2 of them, men, coming up the game trail from the direction of Harlan Falls. She stayed still among the trees and listened until she could make out words. "Not going to work if she won't sell." "She's an 18-year-old girl by herself. She'll sell by February. You watch." "Burrell, I'm telling you, if the survey doesn't confirm the line runs where you think it does..." "It'll confirm it. Dawson knows what I'm paying him to find." The voices faded as the men moved past below her, heading away from the hollow. Brenna stood with her hand axe in her fist and her heart going too fast, and she waited until she couldn't hear anything but the wind before she moved. Burrell. And someone named Dawson. A surveyor he was paying to find something, or to confirm something Burrell wanted to be true about the property line. She went back to the cabin and got out the deed again. She read the eastern boundary description 3 times carefully, mouthing the words. It followed the natural ridge line, it said, to a marked stone at the base of the draw, and from there ran south by southeast along the old survey stakes placed in... She squinted at the handwriting. 1861. She didn't know where those survey stakes were. She'd never looked for them, to them. The next morning, she spent 6 hours walking her eastern boundary, looking for stakes. She found 3 of them, iron pins driven into the rock, still solid after decades. And the 4th she found only after 2 hours of searching, tipped over but still visible under a layer of dead leaves and moss. When she stood at the 4th pin and looked south, she could see exactly where the line ran. And she could also see something that made the skin on her arms go cold. The line ran right through the middle of a natural spring, a bigger one than her seep spring, emerging from the base of the ridge in a steady flow that cut a clear channel south through the rock. A spring like that was worth more than the land around it. It was the kind of water source that could support a whole cattle operation. And if Burrell had a surveyor working to shift the line, even by 50 feet, even by 20, that spring could end up on the wrong side of it. She stood there in this cold November air, looking at that spring, and she thought about the way Burrell had looked at the cave on his first visit. Not at the cabin, at the cave. Because he'd known about the spring. Of course he had. He'd ranched this country for 20 years. And the spring came out of the same ridge that held the cave, and whoever controlled the ridge controlled the water. And he'd offered her $15 for 60 acres with a water source on it, $20. He'd called it generous. She went back to the cabin and sat by the fire for a long time without doing anything else. The chickens clucked quietly in their cave passage. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the temperature was dropping again. She could hear it in the way the wind had gone tight and dry, and in the way the pine trees had stopped their normal murmur and gone silent the way they do before cold weather bites down hard. She needed help. Not a lot of it, and not the kind that cost money she didn't have. But she needed someone who knew land law, someone who dealt with boundary disputes before, and she needed them before Burrell's surveyor put anything on paper that she couldn't challenge. Tom Greer, she thought, the general store owner. He'd lived in this county his whole life. He'd know who to talk to. She went to Harlan Falls the next morning, leaving before dawn to make the trip in daylight. She found Tom Greer behind his counter as usual, but this time she didn't buy anything. She just told him what she'd heard on the south slope, and what she'd found at the eastern boundary, and what she thought it meant. Tom listened without interrupting, which she respected. "Dawson," he said when she finished. "Felix Dawson. He's the county surveyor, technically, but he also does private work." He picked up a pencil and put it down again. "He's done work for Burrell before. 3-4 years back, there was a dispute with the Fenwick family over a creek boundary. Fenwick lost the east pasture." He paused. "Though I'd say the Fenwick family didn't make it easy to help them." "What do I need to do?" "You need your own survey. Before Burrell's man files anything, you need an independent record of where those stakes actually are, signed and witnessed, dated before whatever Dawson produces." He looked at her steadily. "That costs money, Brenna." "How much?" "Depends who you get. Old Hartwell out of the county seat. He's licensed, he's honest, and he's slow. Probably $12. $12. She counted in her head, about 6 left from what she'd started with, plus whatever she could trade. "What does he take in trade?" Tom thought about it. "His wife's been wanting cured rabbit hides. Nice ones. He mentioned it last time he was in here." She had rabbit hides. She'd been curing them for 2 months, saving them with no specific purpose yet. She had 11 good ones and 3 that were rougher. "Is 11 enough?" "I honestly don't know. I can write him a letter if you want. Ask." "Please," she said, "write the letter." She walked home faster than she'd walked anywhere in weeks, and that night she went through her stack of cured hides by firelight, sorting the best ones and stitching them edge to edge into a flat bundle. 11 hides. Each one had taken her several hours from snare to finished. Each one represented a morning she'd gotten up before the cold had fully let go of the air and gone to check the lines, hoping for something. She tied the bundle with a piece of raw hide and set it next to the door. Then she went to the cave and stood at the entrance to the chicken passage, listening to the quiet sounds the hens made in the dark. A low, contented murmur, the rustle of feathers, the occasional soft cluck of a bird resettling on its perch. 7 eggs this morning. Every day, more than the day before. She was not failing. Whatever Burrell was planning, whatever the weather was going to throw at her, she was not failing. The garden was growing in the dark beneath the ridge. The chickens were laying in the cold. The fireplace was drawing clean, and the cabin walls were holding, and every morning she woke up here was a morning she hadn't given in. The ridge was hers. The water was hers. All she had to do was prove it. She went back inside, barred the door against the rising wind, and went to bed. She lay on her back in the dark, with the blanket pulled up to her chin, and she stared at the ceiling of the cabin she'd built with her own 2 hands, listening to the fire breathe and the wind push against the walls. The old-timers were saying it would be the worst winter in 20 years. Let it come, Brenna thought. She was ready for it, or close enough that it didn't matter. Old Hartwell arrived on a Thursday, 12 days after Tom Greer sent the letter. He was a wiry man in his 70s with a white beard trimmed close and hands that were steady as a surgeon's despite the cold. He came up the trail on a gray mare, carrying his surveying equipment in a leather satchel that looked older than most of the trees on the ridge. He didn't say much when he arrived, just nodded at the cabin, looked at the cave mouth behind it, and nodded again like he was confirming something he'd already decided. 11 hides, he said. Tom said 11. Tied and ready. Brenna brought them out from inside the cabin. Hartwell set them on his saddle, pressed the bundle with both hands to feel the quality, and then folded them into his satchel without comment. "Show me where you found the stakes," he said. She walked him along the eastern boundary herself, pointing out each iron pin in turn. Hartwell crouched at every one, brushing the ground clear with a small, stiff brush he carried in his coat pocket, and made measurements and notations in a leather-bound book he held close to his chest so the wind couldn't take the pages. At the fourth stake, the tipped one she'd found under the moss, he spent the longest time pressing the pin back into its original hole, taking compass readings, making notes. He didn't say anything about the spring until he was standing right at it, watching the water move through the channel it had cut over decades of flowing. "That's a good spring," he said. "I know. How much flow in summer, you think?" "I haven't been here in summer, but the channel's wide, and it's still running strong now with everything this cold." She paused. "It stays on my side of the line, doesn't it?" Hartwell looked at his notebook. He looked at the stake behind them and the visible track of the boundary line running along the base of the ridge. He pulled out a measuring chain and handed one end to Brenna without a word. They measured. The spring sat 14 feet inside her eastern boundary. Not close. 14 feet was 14 feet. A clear margin. Nothing you could argue was a surveyor's error in the original placement. "That's your spring," Hartwell said, taking back the chain and coiling it. "I'll have the filed document back to the county office within a week. Dated today, witnessed by me, with photographs of each stake location." He closed his notebook. "If someone else tries to file a competing survey, the date on mine will precede it. Will that hold?" "It'll hold as long as no judge decides otherwise. But judges in this county tend to respect prior documentation." He looked at her steadily. "You have an honest deed, honest stakes, and an honest survey. That's more than most people come to court with." He was back on his mare and up the trail before Brenna had finished thanking him. She stood at the edge of the bowl and watched him go, and the relief she felt was so large and so sudden that she had to put her hand on the cabin wall to steady herself. The spring was hers. On paper, witnessed, dated, filed. Let Burrell bring his surveyor. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees that night. Brenna woke at 2 in the morning to find frost on the inside of the cabin walls. A thin white fur of ice crystals coating the logs near the door, where the chinking was thinnest. She built the fire back up, shoved rags into the gap at the door's base, and then stood for a moment looking at her own breath clouding in the firelight. The calendar in her head said late November. The sky outside said something worse was coming. She'd been watching the signs for a week, the way the pines had gone completely still in the last 2 days. No movement even when there was wind at ground level. The way the birds had disappeared, not just the migrating ones, but the permanent residents, the jays and nuthatches she'd grown accustomed to seeing in the scrub. The way the light had taken on a flat, matte quality, like the sun was working behind frosted glass. Her grandmother, who had grown up in country like this, had called that particular light the iron sky. She'd said when you saw the iron sky, you had maybe 3 days. Brenna spent those 3 days as if she were in a race. She hauled firewood from the deadfall pile until her arms couldn't carry anymore, stacking it inside the cabin and in the mouth of the cave until both spaces were crowded with it. She moved the chickens deeper into the cave, the second side passage, warmer than the first, and built them a new enclosure there, plugging the gaps in the framing with wads of dried moss. She carried water from the seep spring in every container she had, filling the clay pots and 2 wooden pails she'd made from staved pine, and set them along the cave wall where they wouldn't freeze. She pulled up the ripest vegetables from the garden beds, 3 dozen small potatoes, a tangle of garlic, a bundle of cattail roots, and stored them in a woven grass basket hung from a timber above the fireplace, out of the reach of cold. She was restacking the wood on the second day when she heard hooves again, 1 horse this time, coming fast down the trail, and the pace of it made her straighten up and watch the slope. It was one of Burrell's ranch hands, the younger one, the one who'd snickered that first visit. He pulled up at the edge of the bowl and looked down at her, and the expression on his face was different from anything she'd seen from him before. Not sneering, something more like uncomfortable. "Mr. Burrell sent me," he said. "I can see that. He wants to know. He's making a final offer. $30 for the land. He says, no." The ranch hand blinked. "You didn't let me finish." "I know what I need to know." She went back to stacking wood. "Tell him no. Tell him the answer was no at $15 and no at $20 and it's no at $30. And if he keeps sending people up here, I'm going to start charging them a toll for using my trail. The hand sat on his horse for a moment, chewing on something. Then he said, "He's had Felix Dawson out here. Dawson says the spring line might be—" Hartwell filed a survey 2 weeks ago. Dated, witnessed, and sitting in the county record office. She set a log on the stack without looking at him. Whatever Dawson says, it was said after the fact. Any judge will see that. Another silence. The horse stamped and snorted, unhappy about standing still in the cold. "Miss Whitlock," the hand's voice had dropped. "I'm just going to say this. That storm that's coming, everybody in town is saying it's going to be bad. Real bad. Worse than 83. And you're—" He stopped, looked around at the bowl, at the crude cabin and the cave behind it, at the stacked wood and the mudded walls. "You're up here alone. I'm aware. I'm just saying, I appreciate it." She finally looked up at him. He was maybe 20, she realized. Not much older than her. "I mean that. But I'm not selling, and I'm not leaving, and I'm going to be fine. Go on home and get yourself ready for the storm." He looked at her for another moment, then turned his horse and rode back up the slope. Brenna watched him go, then looked at the sky. The iron sky. Still there, heavier than before. She had maybe another day. She worked through the night. The storm came on the third day, exactly as her grandmother's signs had promised. It didn't announce itself with wind or rain the way normal storms did. It arrived in silence, a stillness so complete that Brenna woke at dawn and thought something had gone wrong with her hearing. She went to the door and opened it, and the world outside the cabin was white. Not storm white. Not yet. Just a thin layer of new snow over everything, maybe 2 inches, the kind of snow that looks peaceful and doesn't warn you about what comes behind it. She brought in the last of the firewood. By noon, the wind had started. By mid-afternoon, it had gone from wind to something bigger than wind, something that had weight and intention, that hit the cabin walls like a physical thing you could lean against. The temperature dropped so fast she could watch her thermometer, hung on the cave wall for accuracy, fall degree by degree as the afternoon passed. By the time the light failed, it read 15 degrees below the outside measurement she'd taken at noon. The snow was horizontal now. She could hear it against the shuttered window. She'd built wooden shutters and barred them 2 days ago, a sound like thrown sand, like the storm was trying to strip the bark off the trees. The fireplace was burning as hot as she could push it, and the cabin was warm enough but not comfortable. She wore her coat indoors. She wore both pairs of socks. The chickens, deeper in the cave, had gone quiet. She checked on them twice, holding her candle over the enclosure and counting heads. All 12 present. She'd traded another pot to Helen Pruitt for a second visit and come home with 7 more hens. They were huddled together in a pile of feathers and warmth, and she envied them the simplicity of it. She ate a good meal that night: roasted potato, cattail root, a hard-boiled egg, and she banked the fire the way Emmett had taught her, layering the coals with ash to keep them alive through the night without consuming wood too fast. Then she went to bed in her coat and both pairs of socks with the blanket pulled up and her hat pulled down, and she slept. The storm did not stop the next day, or the day after that. On the third day of the storm, Brenna ran an experiment. She put on every piece of clothing she owned, coat, hat, both shirts, the canvas overvest she'd made from her original feed sack pack, and opened the cabin door. The wind hit her like a wall. The snow was past her knees before she'd taken 3 steps, and it was still falling, still blowing, so thick and fast she couldn't see the pine trees at the edge of the bowl, couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The temperature was, she didn't know exactly. Her thermometer's reading had gone off the scale on the second night, but it was the kind of cold that made her lungs ache on the first breath and her eyelashes start to freeze on the second. She went back inside and barred the door. She was safe. She knew she was safe. The cave was steady at its usual temperature. The chickens were producing eggs. The fire was holding. Her food stores were adequate. But the knowledge of safety was something her mind understood and her body didn't entirely believe. And the 3 days of howling wind and darkness had started to work on her in ways she hadn't prepared for. She talked to the chickens more than was probably reasonable. She recited the names of every plant her grandmother had taught her, in order, the way some people count to sleep. She sang, badly, because she'd never been much of a singer. The 3 songs she could remember all the words to, and then hummed the ones she couldn't, and then gave up and sat by the fire in silence for a long time, watching the flames. On the fourth night of the storm, at a point when the wind was at its loudest and Brenna was sitting by the fire trying to remember whether she'd checked the chicken water that morning or only dreamed she had, she heard something. She went still. It came again. A sound from outside the door. Not the wind, which she'd learned the sound of by now, the way you learn a person's particular voice. Something else. Irregular. Stopping and starting, fists on wood. Someone was knocking on her door. She grabbed the knife from her belt and went to the door. "Who's there?" Nothing for a moment. Then a voice. Male, rough, barely audible over the storm. "Please, please, it's Emmett. She unbarred the door and threw it open. The man who fell through it was not Emmett. He was younger, maybe 35, with a heavy trapper's coat so caked in snow and ice that he looked like something that had been buried and dug up. He went to his knees just inside the door, and she saw that his hands, bare, no gloves, were white in the way that wasn't cold anymore but was past cold, the way that meant damage. She got the door shut behind him before she dealt with anything else. Then she got down on the floor beside him. Hey, look at me! Can you hear me?" He looked at her. His eyes were going in and out of focus. "The others," he said. We were the Calloway cabin. 3 more. Maybe 4. Where?" "South Slope. Below the draw. We were coming up. Tried to make the Fenwick place, but the trail..." He coughed. It was a wet sound that she didn't like. "Miss, there's a woman and 2 men, and I think one of the men is..." "How far?" "Half mile. Maybe. South Slope." She looked at him. She looked at his hands. She looked at the storm raging outside the door she'd just barred. "What's your name?" she asked. Cord Vickers. I'm a trapper. All right, Cord." She took his hands in hers and held them carefully, not rubbing. That was the wrong thing to do with frostbitten hands. "I'm going to put you next to the fire. I need you to stay conscious. Can you do that?" I'm going to the others, but I need you to stay awake and keep the fire going while I'm gone. If the fire goes out, none of us make it. Do you understand me?" He nodded. His eyes were clearer now, though his face was still the color of old wax. She got him to the fire, positioned his hands in front of the heat, not too close, but close enough, and propped him against the wall with a piece of firewood behind his back so he couldn't slump sideways. She put a pot of water on to heat. She gave him one of her boiled potatoes and told him to eat it slowly. Then she put on every piece of clothing she owned and went back to the supply corner of the cave and got the rope. 20 feet. She tied one end to the iron spike she'd driven into the cave wall near the entrance for hanging tools, and she coiled the rest over her shoulder. She took the good candle lantern, the one with the glass sides that kept the flame alive in wind, and she lit it. She thought about Emmett's axe, still hanging by the door. She took it. She opened the cabin door and walked into the storm. The snow hit her like a physical blow, and the wind took her breath and replaced it with nothing. She bent forward and moved. The lantern's flame flickered wildly inside the glass, but held. She used the rope to keep herself anchored to the cabin for the first 50 feet, letting it play out behind her as she pushed through snow that was waist-deep in the hollows and thigh-deep on the harder ground. When the rope ran out, she tied the end to the branch of a pine tree she'd recognized by its shape even in the blizzard. She'd walked this ground enough to know it in daylight, and she held that knowledge like a map in her head, checking each landmark against what she could barely see. She almost missed them. She would have missed them if one of them hadn't been holding a lantern. Not lit. It had gone out hours ago, but the metal of it caught her candle flame for just a fraction of a second. A tiny cold gleam from behind a snowdrift 20 feet to her left. She pushed through the drift and found them. There were 4. A woman in her 40s, Marge Calloway, of all people, the woman from the porch in Harlan Falls, curled on the ground in the snow with her knees drawn up. 2 men, one conscious and one not, huddled against a fallen tree. And behind the tree, barely visible, the still shape of a 4th person who turned out, when Brenna grabbed his shoulder, to be breathing. All 4 were past shivering. Past shivering was the dangerous place. "Get up," she said to the conscious man. She didn't know him. "Get up right now. I need you on your feet." "Can't," he said. "Yes, you can. I've got a shelter 50 yards from here. You can die in the snow or you can get up. Those are your choices. She shoved her hand under his arm and hauled. He came up, barely. His legs weren't right. He couldn't feel them probably, but they held enough. She got him upright with one arm and grabbed Marge Calloway with the other, pulling the woman to her feet and bracing her against her own body. Marge made a sound like something broken, but she stood. Walk, Brenna told them both. Follow my lantern. Don't stop. The unconscious man. She couldn't move him without dropping the other two. She left him against the tree, made a mental mark of the exact location, and started moving. 50 yards had never been so long. She got the first two through the cabin door, turned them over to Cord Vickers, who was still conscious, still tending the fire, bless his stubbornness, and went back out. The second trip was harder because she was already tired, already cold, and because the fourth person was a man the size of a barrel who had to be mostly dragged. She got a grip on his coat collar and leaned forward and pulled, and he came through the snow inch by inch, and by the time she got him to the cabin door, she'd lost feeling in her left foot and her lungs were burning. She got him inside. She got the door shut. She stood against the door with her eyes closed and her chest heaving for what felt like a long time. There's 4 of you, she said when she could talk. I count 4. There's 4, Cord said from somewhere near the fire. Good. She opened her eyes. The cabin was crowded in a way it had never been. 5 people where there'd been one for months, the air already shifting from cold to warm as all those bodies added their heat. Marge Calloway was sitting against the wall with her hands wrapped around a cup of warm water, and she was looking at Brenna with an expression that Brenna had never seen on anyone's face before and didn't quite know what to do with. You came back, Marge said. I said I was going to. But you... Marge stopped. Her voice had gone strange. You don't even know me. Brenna was pulling off her outer coat, shaking the snow onto the floor. Her hands weren't working quite right yet. I know you enough. I said... Marge's voice broke. She pressed her lips together for a moment. I said you wouldn't last until Christmas. You weren't the only one. Brenna hung the coat and turned back to the room. The man she didn't know, the one who'd been partly conscious, was sitting up now. The fourth one, the barrel-sized one she'd dragged through the snow, was still flat on the floor but breathing visibly, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Cord Vickers was watching her from across the fire with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already figured out. You tied yourself to the cabin with a rope, he said, so I could find my way back. And you went out twice. There were 4 of you. He didn't say anything else for a moment. Then he looked down at his hands, still pale, the color slowly and painfully returning, and then back up at her. The spring, he said. There's a spring on the east boundary, isn't there? I've seen it from the North Trail. Yes. Burrell wants it. She didn't answer. He told me, he was telling people, that you'd sell by winter, that you'd be gone. Cord turned one of his damaged hands over in front of the fire, watching the color change. I laughed. I thought it was funny. An 18-year-old girl thinking she could hold a piece of land against Clyde Burrell. He paused. I'm sorry for that. Brenna looked at him. He was a man who'd just had the worst night of his life, sitting in a cabin that had saved it, apologizing to the person who'd built the cabin. She thought there was probably something to say to that, but she was too tired to find the right words, so she just nodded. There's food, she said, potatoes and eggs. You should eat something. She fed all 5 of them from her stores and tried not to do the arithmetic on what that cost her. And the fire burned on, and the storm howled outside the walls she'd built with her own 2 hands. And in the cave behind the back wall, the chickens murmured quietly to each other in the dark, warm and alive, knowing nothing about any of it. The storm broke on the 6th day. It didn't end gracefully. It sputtered and gusted through the night, throwing one last violent tantrum of wind that shook the cabin walls hard enough to knock Brenna's tin cup off its hook, and then somewhere around dawn, it simply stopped, the way a sick child finally stops crying from exhaustion. The silence that followed was so complete it woke everyone in the cabin at the same time. 5 people, blinking at each other in the gray morning light. 5 people who had not had a moment of real privacy in 6 days, who had slept in shifts and eaten from the same pot and learned more about each other's habits and sounds and smells than any of them had intended. Brenna was already up. She'd been up for an hour, feeding the fire and checking the chickens and doing the accounting she'd been putting off. Her food stores were lower than she'd like. Not critically. She wasn't going to starve, but feeding 5 people for 6 days had eaten through her potato supply faster than she'd planned, and she was down to her last jar of rendered lard and maybe 3 pounds of cornmeal. The chickens were still laying, which helped, and the garden beds in the cave were still producing, but the gap between what she had and what she'd calculated she'd need to carry herself through to spring had narrowed in a way that made her jaw tight when she thought about it. She didn't tell the others. It wasn't their problem to carry. Cord Vickers was the first one fully upright. His hands were healing. The frostbite had been real but not catastrophic. 2 fingers on his left hand blistered badly, the rest sore and peeling but intact. He'd spent the storm being more useful than she'd expected, tending the fire when she slept, keeping the others calm during the worst of the howling nights when the wind made sounds that didn't seem like any natural thing. He came and stood beside her at the cave entrance where she was looking at the garden beds by lantern light. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly. "It's fine." He looked at her sideways. "You fed 5 people for 6 days out of a 1-woman winter store. How bad is it?" She told him the actual numbers. He listened without interrupting. "I can get to my trapping cabin," he said when she finished. "It's 4 miles northeast, up on the shoulder of the ridge. I've got dried meat, venison, some elk, and a sack of dried beans I put up in October. If the snow's settled enough to walk on crust, I can make it there and back in a day. Your hands are attached to my arms, which still work." He turned them over, looking at the damaged fingers. "I've trapped in worse shape than this." "I know you have. I'm not questioning that." She paused. "What I'm asking is whether it's worth the risk to you." He looked at her. It seemed to catch him off guard, that question. The distinction she'd drawn between what he could do and whether it was worth him doing it. "Yes," he said. "It is. You went out twice in that storm for people you didn't know. I can walk 4 miles in good visibility for someone who kept me alive." He picked up his coat from the hook by the door. "I'll take the Calloway boy. He's young and his feet are all right. We'll make better time with 2. She didn't argue further. She gave him the rope to use on the steepest sections of trail and watched him and the young Calloway man, Marge's son, she'd learned, 19 years old and considerably chastened by the last 6 days, climb up the slope and disappear into the pine trees. Marge Calloway was sitting up on the cave floor when Brenna came back inside. She'd been sleeping there, one of the smaller chambers, warmer than the cabin, and she had the look of someone who'd been awake for a while but hadn't been ready to talk yet. Her hands were wrapped in strips of cloth. Her face was still slightly swollen from the cold. "I need to ask you something," Marge said. Brenna sat down across from her. "Go ahead." "How does it grow?" Marge was looking at the raised beds along the cave wall. In the lantern light, the green of the potato plants was almost surreal, that vivid living color against the gray rock. "It's underground. It's winter. How does it grow?" "Temperature stays steady, water from the seep, light from candles. Not as much as they'd want outdoors, but enough." Brenna reached over and pressed her thumb into the soil of the nearest bed. "And the soil itself? It's rich in a way that surface soil here isn't." "How?" Brenna hesitated for a fraction of a second, then decided honesty was simpler. "Bat guano. There are 2 bat colonies deeper in the cave. I've been composting it with topsoil and sedge grass for months." Marge stared at her. Then she laughed. A real laugh. The first one Brenna had heard from her in 6 days, rough and surprised. "You're growing food in bat droppings." "The best fertilizer there is, my grandmother told me." Marge shook her head slowly. She looked at the garden beds. She looked at the chickens in their enclosure at the far end of the passage, just visible in the lantern's reach. She looked at the clay pots of water lined up along the wall, unfrozen because the cave temperature had never dropped low enough to touch them. "I have to ask you something else," Marge said. Her voice had changed, gone careful. "All right. Did you know, before the storm, did you know what you were building, that it would work this well?" Brenna thought about how to answer that honestly. "I knew the theory. I knew what the cave could do if I built around it right. Whether it would actually work?" She stopped. "No. I didn't know for certain. I just knew it was the best option I could see." Marge was quiet for a moment. "My husband told half the county you'd be dead before Christmas." I know. Your daughter-in-law mentioned it. Another silence. His name is Gerald. He's a proud man. Marge looked at her hands. He's not a cruel man. When he doesn't understand something, he calls it foolish. It's a habit. Brenna didn't say anything. I'm going to tell him he was wrong, Marge said. I want you to know that. I'm going to go home, and I'm going to tell him, and I'm going to tell everyone in Harlan Falls what's in this cave. She met Brenna's eyes. If that's all right with you. You can tell people whatever you want, Mrs. Calloway. It's not a secret. Marge, the older woman said. Call me Marge. The two men Brenna had pulled from the storm, the ones she hadn't known, turned out to be brothers. Their name was Holt, Daniel Holt and his older brother Ray. They were farmers from the Eastern Valley who'd been trying to reach Ray's wife's family in the North Township when the storm hit. Ray was the one she'd dragged by his coat collar through the snow, the barrel-built one. And when he was recovered enough to move around, he spent most of his time in the cave watching the garden beds with an expression of intense concentration. On the fourth day of the recovery, he came to Brenna while she was splitting kindling outside the cabin door. The temperature was still brutal, but the sky had cleared, and the snow sparkled in a way that would have been beautiful if it weren't also a reminder that the world was still frozen solid in every direction. I want to ask you about the beds, Ray said. She kept splitting. What about them? The framing, you used flat stone. It's what I had, but you set them level, even on that uneven floor. I chipped the high spots, and I shimmed the low ones with slate fragments. He was quiet for a moment, watching her work the axe. I farm bottomland in the East Valley. Good soil, but we flood in spring. Every year we lose the first planting to the melt. He crossed his arms over his chest. I've been thinking about raised beds, but I never thought about, you've got them on stone. There's nothing for the water to rot. The drainage is through the gaps between the stones at the base. It just runs out onto the cave floor and channels down to the low end. She set another piece and split it. It took me 3 beds to figure out the angle. The first 2 stayed too wet. Ray nodded slowly. He had the look of a man storing information. Could you grow other things? Not just root crops. I've been thinking about that. Dried bean seeds would probably germinate if the temperature's stable enough, and I want to try some kind of leafy green in the spring. Things that don't need a lot of direct light. Watercress, maybe, if I can get it started near the seep basin. Watercress, he repeated. In a cave. I know how it sounds. No? He shook his head. No, I'm not laughing. I watched you pull my brother through a blizzard by his coat collar. I'm not laughing at anything you say. He turned back toward the cave entrance. I want to learn more about this before I leave, if you're willing to show me. She showed him. Cord and the Calloway boy came back the next morning with 2 canvas sacks of dried meat and a bag of beans, and Brenna cooked a proper meal for everyone that night. A thick stew of venison and beans and cattail root with wild garlic stirred in at the end, eaten from clay bowls around the fireplace, while the last of the wind pushed against the shuttered window and couldn't get in. It was the strangest dinner she'd ever been part of. 5 people in a cabin the size of a large room, eating food that had no business existing in the middle of a frontier winter, and all of them aware of that strangeness in a way that made the conversation both easier and harder than normal conversation. Daniel Holt, who'd been mostly quiet through the whole recovery, a thin younger man who watched more than he spoke, said out of nowhere, "How old are you?" 18, Brenna said. He nodded, looking at his bowl. "I'm 23. I thought I knew something about hard work." He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. Cord was watching the fire. "Burrell's going to hear about this," he said. "About the storm, about this place, about all of it. He already knows about this place. He knows you built a cabin. He doesn't know—" Cord gestured at the cave behind the canvas curtain, meaning everything behind it. "He doesn't know what you actually built. Does it change anything?" Cord considered. "It might. Man like Burrell thinks in terms of what things are worth, what he can take. He figured a girl alone on Badland was a problem that would solve itself." He looked at her. "Now he's going to figure out that the land isn't bad and the girl isn't going anywhere. And he's going to have to decide what that changes for him." Brenna set down her bowl. "Let him decide. I've got a filed survey and a legitimate deed, and I haven't moved an inch since I got here. He can bring whatever he wants. He could cause trouble at the county level, Cord said. He knows the circuit judge. So do I, Marge said from across the fire. Everyone looked at her. She shrugged, slightly defensive. Gerald plays cards with Judge Abernathy every second Thursday. I'm just saying. Brenna looked at Marge. Marge looked back at her with an expression that said she knew exactly what she'd just offered and meant it. I might take you up on that, Brenna said. I'm counting on it. The snow had settled and crusted enough by the following morning for the survivors to make the walk back to Harlan Falls. Brenna stood outside the cabin and watched them prepare. Lacing boots, pulling on extra layers, saying small, slightly awkward things that people say when a shared extreme experience ends and they have to go back to being strangers again. Ray Holt shook her hand, not the way men shook hands with each other, that quick, hard grip, but carefully, deliberately, looking at her when he did it. I'm going to try the raised beds in spring, he said. If I can't figure something out, can I write to you? Address it to Iron Hollow Ridge, Harlan Falls County. It'll find me. His younger brother Daniel did something she didn't expect. He pulled a small folding knife from his coat pocket and held it out to her. This was my father's, he said. It's a good blade. I want you to have it. I can't take your father's knife. You can. He would have wanted. He was the kind of man who respected people who did things. He pressed it into her hand. Please. She took it. She didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything, just closed her fingers around the handle and nodded. Marge was last. She stood in front of Brenna for a moment with snow up to her knees and a borrowed scarf around her head that was 2 sizes too large for her and made her look slightly ridiculous. And she said, You know what I keep thinking about? What? I thought you were stubborn and foolish. I told Gerald you were the kind of girl who was too proud to know when she was beaten. She paused. What I didn't understand is that there's 2 kinds of pride. There's the kind that stops you from seeing what's real. And there's the kind that keeps you working when everything real is telling you to stop. She looked at the cabin, at the cave behind it, at the whole impossible thing Brenna had made out of a worthless deed and a winter's worth of sheer refusal. I mixed them up. Brenna's throat was doing something she didn't particularly want it to do. She made herself hold Marge's gaze. Safe walk home, she said. Safe everything, Marge said back, and she turned and followed the others up the slope, her boots punching through the crust with every step, until the pines took all of them and the bowl was quiet again. Brenna stood in the snow and listened to the silence. She was alone again. She'd been alone for months before the storm, and it had been fine. More than fine. It had been the right thing, the necessary thing. But this silence felt different from the silence before. Heavier, and also somehow larger. Like a room that's just had furniture moved out of it, where you're suddenly aware of how much space there is. She went inside and did the things that needed doing. Banked the fire, checked the chickens, checked the garden beds, ate something. She worked through the afternoon, sorting and restacking and repairing the small damages the crowded days had left behind. A crack in one of the clay pots, a loose joint in the chicken enclosure's gate, a section of chinking near the door that had been knocked loose by someone's boot. Physical work, the kind that kept your hands busy and let your mind do what it needed to do underneath. She was in the cave, pressing new clay into the pot's crack, when she heard the horse outside. 1 horse. She knew it by now. The difference between 1 and 2 and 3. The weight of it. The pace. She set down the pot and picked up the hand axe from where it hung by the cave entrance and went to the cabin door. Clyde Burrell sat his horse at the edge of the bowl. He was alone. He wasn't wearing his ranch boss expression, the one he'd worn every other time he'd come here, the flat, patient look of a man who believes waiting is its own kind of winning. He looked like a man who'd spent a rough week and was recalculating. He didn't get off his horse. I heard what happened, he said, with the Calloway woman and the Holt brothers. And Vickers. Brenna stood in her doorway with the axe at her side. News travels fast, even in a blizzard. Vickers told people at the saloon. He talks when he drinks. Burrell looked past her at the cabin, at the cave behind it. He was doing what he always did, adding things up. But something about the total was different this time. She could see it in the set of his jaw. That survey Hartwell filed. I saw it at the county office. Then you know where my lines are. I know. He was quiet for a moment. A horse picked its way somewhere up on the ridge, hooves on ice, and then the sound faded. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't working to change something that shouldn't have been changed. She hadn't expected that. She kept her face still. I've been in this county 20 years, Burrell said. I've done a lot of things that were legal, and a few things that were close to the line, and one or two things I'm not proud of. Taking an 18-year-old girl's water rights away from her while she was trying to survive a winter. He stopped. Dawson's survey is going to disappear. I'll see to it personally. The wind moved through the pines at the ridge top. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Brenna asked. Because you deserve to know. He gathered his reins, not yet turning the horse. And because I want to make you an offer. A fair one this time. Not to buy you out. I can see that conversation is finished. His jaw tightened slightly. I need water for my north herd next summer. That spring of yours is the best source between here and the Fenwick Creek. I'd like to negotiate a water rights agreement. Seasonal access, terms to be decided, with payment to you in cash or goods, your preference. Brenna looked at him. The man was Clyde Burrell, but she wasn't going to forget what she'd heard on that south slope. The conversation about paying a surveyor to find what he wanted to find. That didn't go away because he'd had a change of calculation, but a fair deal was a fair deal, if the terms were right. I'll want it in writing, she said. Witnessed and filed, same as the survey. That's reasonable. And I set the terms for access. Hours, volume, how many head, and when. My spring, my rules. His jaw tightened again and then loosened. Also reasonable. And the first payment comes before the first access, not after. Agreed. She looked at him for another moment. Why don't you come back in 2 weeks? Bring a written draft and we'll go over it. Burrell nodded once. He turned his horse and rode back up the slope without another word, and Brenna watched him go until the ridge swallowed him. She stood in the doorway for a long time after, the axe loose in her hand, the cold pressing in around her from every side. She hadn't beaten Burrell exactly. She hadn't made him her friend. What she'd done was something more complicated and probably more durable. She'd made herself someone he had to deal with honestly, because the alternative cost more than it was worth. That was its own kind of victory, and she knew it, and she let herself feel it standing there in the snow outside the cabin she'd built. The afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the ridge above her. The storm's snowfall had coated every surface, every branch and rock ledge and outcrop, and the low winter sun was hitting it at an angle that turned the whole ridge face into something that looked almost warm. Brenna squinted up at it, shading her eyes with her free hand. 60 acres, every foot of it hers. She went back inside, hung the axe on its hook, and got to work. There was always more work. The pot still needed its crack sealed. The garden beds needed watering. The chickens needed feed. The firewood stack inside the cabin had gotten low during the crowded days and needed building back up before tonight's temperature drop. She did all of it. She did it the way she'd been doing everything since the morning she'd walked out of her father's house with $17 and a worthless deed. Not because it was easy, not because she felt like it, but because this was her place and these were her things, and taking care of them was the same as taking care of herself. The fire burned. The chickens murmured. In the cave behind the canvas curtain, green things grew in the dark. Outside, the ridge stood against the winter sky the same way it had stood against every winter before this one and every winter before that. Solid. Patient. Older than anyone's arguments about what it was worth, but now it had a name that meant something. Iron Hollow Ridge, and the name meant something because of the person living on it, and that person wasn't leaving. January ground down into February the way hard winters do. Not with any particular drama, just with a steady, relentless pressure, like a thumb pressing on a bruise. The snow didn't melt so much as it compacted, layer on layer, until the bowl of Iron Hollow Ridge sat under 3 feet of dense crystalline white that held the shape of boot prints for days. Brenna worked through all of it. The water rights agreement with Burrell came back in writing 12 days after his visit, delivered by the same young ranch hand who'd ridden up here with the final offer months ago. The hand, his name turned out to be Pete, she'd learned that during the recovery days, left the document on the cabin step with a note that said only, "Mr. Burrell said to take your time reading it." She took 3 days. She read every line twice, and then she wrote 4 amendments in the margins in her clearest handwriting, crossed 2 clauses entirely, and sent it back with Pete when he came through again. It went back and forth one more time before she was satisfied, and then she rode into Harlan Falls. She'd traded 2 weeks of egg supply to a neighboring trapper for the use of his spare horse, and filed the agreement at the county office herself, standing at the clerk's counter until Poole had stamped it and she'd seen it go into the right drawer. When she walked out of the county office and into the winter sunlight, Tom Greer was standing on the boardwalk outside his store watching her. "I heard about the storm," he said. "About the people you brought in. Cord Vickers talks too much." "He does." Tom studied her for a moment. He looked like a man trying to figure out how something had become different without his noticing the change happening. "You could have been killed going out in that." "I could have been killed 6 different ways since September." She tucked the receipt copy of the filed agreement into her coat. That never seemed like a good enough reason not to do something. Tom was quiet. Then he said, "I've got a proposition for you, if you're interested." She waited. "There are 2 families I know of, good people, not stupid people, who are looking at land up near the North Ridge. They've got some money and some tools, and they want to build, but they don't know the terrain. They don't know what the land can do up there." He paused. "I was thinking you might, and I was thinking knowing might be worth something to them." Brenna looked at him. "You want me to advise them. I want you to talk to them. What you tell them and what they pay you for it is between you and them." He shrugged, the elaborately casual shrug of a man who's been in commerce long enough to know when to look like he's not suggesting anything. "I just thought I'd mention it." She thought about it for about 4 seconds. "Set up a meeting," she said. She rode home with the filed agreement in her coat and Tom Greer's proposition turning over in her mind, and by the time she got the borrowed horse back to the trapper and walked the last 2 miles up the trail to the bowl, she'd started working out what she actually knew that was worth knowing. Not just the cave, that was specific to her land, but the broader knowledge, reading terrain for water, understanding temperature differentials in ridge country, how to build against the weather instead of against the wind, how to make soil where there wasn't any, how to figure out what a piece of land could do before you put your life on it. She'd learned all of that in the last 5 months. She'd learned it by failing and trying again and failing better and trying once more, by following every lead her grandmother had ever given her, and several she'd figured out entirely on her own. It wasn't a formal education. It wasn't anything anyone had handed her. But it was real. And it was hers. And apparently it was worth something to people who didn't have it. That was a thought worth sitting with. February gave way to March, the way it always does on the frontier. Messily, reluctantly, with false starts and setbacks, and one last hard freeze that had Brenna swearing at the cave ceiling when she found ice in the water basin one morning. But the light was changing. She could feel it before she could see it. The quality of the afternoon sun on the south-facing rock, the way the snow around the seep spring started pulling back a few inches further every day. A thin, dark ring of bare ground spreading like the land itself was deciding to wake up. The chickens felt it too. Egg production picked up. The 2 younger hens started making a different sound than they'd made all winter, something more energetic and less resigned, and Brenna found herself talking to them more cheerfully, which was perhaps not the most dignified development, but was hard to argue with. The garden beds were doing things she hadn't expected. The cattail root sections had spread significantly over the winter, pushing rhizomes through the cave floor soil and coming up in 3 new spots she hadn't planted. The garlic was coming in dense and strong, the leaves a deep, confident green that made the cave smell like something alive. And in the newest beds, the ones she'd planted last, in November, as an experiment, the dried bean seeds she'd pressed into the rich guano compost soil were throwing up shoots that were stronger and faster than any beans she'd ever seen grown in surface soil. She stared at those bean plants for a long time one morning, just stood in the cave with the lantern in her hand, looking at the pale green of the new growth pushing up out of the dark. Emmett Slade came back in late March, riding the same mule, wearing the same hat, looking approximately the same as he always did, which was like a man for whom time moved differently than it did for everyone else, a slower and more patient version of the same hours. He came into the bowl and stopped at the edge and looked at everything. The cabin, which had settled visibly over the winter, the logs darkening from exposure and the roofline sitting more solidly into its foundation. The livestock lean-to, which now held 2 goats. She'd traded a month's worth of eggs, plus 3 clay pots to a farm family heading west who couldn't take their animals with them. The new section of fencing she'd started along the southern edge of the bowl using a post and rail system she'd designed herself to work with the rocky ground. The kitchen garden she'd started outside the cave entrance now that the ground was starting to soften. Small, experimental, but real. Emmett looked at all of it without saying anything for a long time. "The ridgepole," he said finally. "What about it?" "East End, you fixed it." "I did it in January. I found a way to get the lift using the rope and a prop from inside the attic space." "By yourself?" "There was nobody else." He dismounted. He walked to the lean-to and looked at the goats. 2 does, one of them visibly pregnant, and at the bedding she'd put down, and at the small feed rack she'd constructed from bent pine branches. He examined the fencing. He went inside the cabin and stood by the fireplace and looked at the way she'd reworked the flue angle on the chimney, which he'd told her in October was drawing wrong. "How'd you fix the draft?" he asked. "Offset deflector, a flat stone set at an angle inside the flue throat. It redirects the column." She showed him with her hand. "Took me 4 tries to get the angle right." "Where'd you learn that?" "I made it up." He made the sound that might have been a laugh. He went into the cave and walked to the garden beds and stood there, looking at them the way he'd looked at everything else. Slowly, taking it in all the way, not just the surface of it. He crouched at the bean plants and pressed the soil. He looked at the expanded cattail bed. He found the spot where the second bat colony's passage opened and looked at her over his shoulder. "You're not disturbing them," he said. "I've never set foot past that passage. They're producing guano. I take what falls in the main chambers and leave the rest." Emmett stood up. He put his hand flat against the cave wall the way he'd done on his first visit, feeling the temperature. He stood like that for a moment, and then he took his hand away. "I've been trapping this ridge for 15 years, he said. "I know. You said that before." "I know I did." He turned around. "I want to say something to you, and I want you to hear it properly." She waited. "What you've done here is not normal. I don't mean that as a compliment exactly. I mean it as a fact. I've seen people come out to the frontier and work hard and still fail, not because they were foolish or lazy, but because hard work isn't always enough. Hard work plus the right idea at the right time. That's rarer." He picked up his hat and held it in his hands instead of putting it on. "Your grandmother was the smartest woman I knew in 40 years of living rough. I think she knew something about you when she left you this land." Brenna opened her mouth and closed it again. "I'm not saying she planned it," Emmett said. "I'm saying smart people sometimes leave the right things to the right people without knowing exactly why." He put his hat back on. "That's all." He stayed for 2 days that visit, which was new. He helped her dig the post holes for the extended fencing. His arms were still stronger than hers for that particular work, though she didn't tell him she'd noticed. And in the evenings, he told her things. Not lessons exactly. More like information offered sideways, the way experienced people sometimes teach, making it sound like conversation. How to read snowmelt patterns for the best spring planting timing. How to tell which wild plants would naturalize in a specific microclimate without you having to tend them. How to track the movements of the deer herd that wintered on the south slope so you could plan your hunting without depleting them. She listened to all of it and stored it away the way she stored everything, completely, and for later. On the morning he left, he unstrapped something from behind his saddle and handed it down to her. It was a book. Old, its cover worn smooth, the spine repaired with a strip of rawhide. On the cover, in faded gold lettering, Practical Observations on Frontier Land and Climate, Volume 2. "Volume 2, she said. "Volume 1 burned in a fire in 68. This one survived." He gathered his reins. "There's a chapter in the middle on underground cultivation. Someone who knew what they were doing wrote it. You might find you agree with most of it." She held the book in both hands. "Thank you, Emmett." He clicked at the mule. "Don't thank me. Build something worth thanking." He rode up the slope and over the ridge, and she stood in the mud of early spring watching him go. And she thought that there were some debts you couldn't pay back directly, only forward, and that was probably the point. The 2 families Tom Greer had mentioned came out to see her in April, a husband and wife named Sutter, and a widower named Crane with 2 teenage sons. She'd met them first in Harlan Falls, at Tom's store, sitting around his back room on crates and empty barrels in a conversation that was slightly awkward at first because none of them quite knew what the protocol was. She was 19 years old at this point, several months past her birthday, which she'd spent alone in the cave repairing the cattail beds. She was advising people twice her age about land they were about to stake their lives on. She told them what she actually knew, which meant she also told them what she didn't know, and she told them where the line between those two things ran. She told them about reading for water before anything else, finding the seep lines, the low-pressure indicators in the rock, the vegetation patterns that showed where subsurface moisture moved. She told them about temperature differentials and how the north faces of ridges held cold longer than most people expected, and the south faces thawed faster than anyone planned for. She told them about building against the cave in a way that used the rock as a partner rather than a backdrop. And she told them the things she'd been turning over in her mind since Emmett's visit, the things she thought was actually the most important. The land isn't going to be what you want it to be, she said. It's going to be what it is. Your job isn't to fight that. Your job is to figure out what it already is and build from there. She looked at both families across the cluttered back room. The land I have, everyone said it was worthless, rocky, bad soil, nothing but a cave. But the cave was the whole point. The thing they called a flaw was the thing that made it work. So before you decide what a piece of land can't do, spend a long time figuring out what it can. Joel Sutter, the husband, had been a farmer all his life. He had the look of a man who'd learned things the expensive way and wasn't excited about doing it again. He said, "How do you know the difference between a flaw you work around and a feature you work with?" "You don't always," Brenna said. "That's honest. Sometimes you build the wrong thing in the wrong place. But the question to ask is not what's wrong with this land, but what is this land already doing? Water finds its level. Cold finds its shape. If you watch long enough before you build, the land will tell you what it wants to hold." There was a silence after that, not an uncomfortable one. She charged them each a fair consulting fee. Tom had told her what was reasonable, and she'd halved it because she wasn't sure yet what her information was actually worth in the market. And then she looked at what she'd halved it to and doubled it back because she'd spent the winter learning it. It was enough to buy seed stock for the spring planting. It was enough to buy a length of iron pipe she'd been thinking about for diverting the seep spring into a more controlled channel. It was enough to matter. The Sutters found land on the northwest shoulder of the ridge, 2 miles from Brenna's bowl, and broke ground in May. The widower Crane took a piece of bottomland further south that Brenna had actually tried to talk him out of, flood risk. But he was a man who'd made up his mind, and she'd said her piece and let it go. By the time the snow was fully off the ground and the bowl was green for the first time since she'd arrived, Brenna had 14 chickens, 3 goats. The pregnant doe had delivered twins in early April, both does, which she'd taken as a sign of something even though she didn't specifically believe in signs, a kitchen garden that was coming in better than she'd hoped, and cave beds producing enough food that she'd started selling the surplus. Not much. Not yet, but enough. She was hauling water from the spring to the kitchen garden one morning in late May when she heard someone on the trail, and she looked up to see a figure she hadn't expected, her stepbrother Harold. 7 years old, which meant he'd been 8 by now. She'd lost track of time in a way that still surprised her. He was standing at the edge of the bowl looking at everything with his mouth slightly open, and behind him, picking her way more carefully down the slope, was Doris. Brenna set down the water bucket. Doris looked tired. She looked older than 32, which she must still be, barely. She had Harold by the hand and a basket over her arm, and she stopped at the edge of the bowl and looked at Brenna, and then at the cabin, and then at the goats grazing along the south wall, and then at Brenna again. "Tom Greer told me where to find you," she said. "I know he did. I asked him to." Doris blinked. I told him 6 months ago that if Doris Whitlock ever asked, tell her how to get here." Brenna picked up the water bucket again. "I've been waiting." Doris came the rest of the way down the slope. Harold had already run ahead, drawn to the goats in the way that small children are drawn to anything that might let them pet it. One of the does allowed herself to be approached with a tolerance that surprised Brenna, because that particular doe was usually difficult. Doris stood in front of the cabin and looked at it. She looked at it the way Emmett had looked at it that first visit, really looked. Not just at the surface, but at the fact of it, at what it meant that it was here at all. "He left," Doris said, "in February. Your father. He took what was left in the account, and he left." She said it plainly, without extra weight on it, the way you say things that have already happened and been absorbed. "It's just me and the kids now. The farm—" She stopped. "The bank's going to take the farm." "I know," Brenna said. "I heard." You heard. It's a small county. She put the water bucket down again. I want you to come here, you and Harold and Bess. Doris stared at her. There's room, not comfort. I won't promise that. But there's room, and there's food, and there's work, real work. Brenna looked at her steadily. I can't pay you wages, not yet. But we'd split everything equal. What the land makes, we split. What we build, we both own a share of. Brenna, I know you didn't ask for this. I know you didn't ask for any of it. But you gave me $2 silver when you didn't have to. And you told me I was as stubborn as my grandmother, and you were right on both counts. She paused. And I could use another pair of hands, specifically yours, because you're practical and you know how to work, and you don't have romantic ideas about what frontier life looks like. Doris laughed. It was an exhausted laugh, but a real one. What would I do? She asked. The kitchen garden needs someone who knows plants better than I do. The chickens need consistent management. I'm not consistent. I'm always being pulled to the next problem, and I want to expand the cave beds, which means more time underground doing work I'd rather hand off. Brenna picked up the bucket a third time. And you can make soap. I know you can because yours was the best soap in the county, and I've been using creek water and pine ash for 6 months, and my hands look like they belong to someone 3 times my age. Doris looked at her hands. She looked at Brenna's hands. Then she looked at Harold, who was now sitting in the mud beside the tolerant goat, apparently having a conversation with it. Bess is 4, Doris said. She'd be underfoot constantly. The chickens will occupy her. They occupy me, and I'm 19. Another pause. Doris pressed her lips together, and Brenna could see the war happening behind her eyes. Pride and practicality, fear and something that wasn't quite hope yet, but was headed that direction. I'd need to bring the milk cow, Doris said finally. She's mine. She was my mother's. The lean-to will hold her. And Harold needs to be in school come fall. There's a schoolhouse being built in Harlan Falls. Tom Greer told me, September term. Brenna looked at her. 4 miles on a trail that'll be better by fall than it is now. Doris nodded slowly. Not saying yes exactly. Saying something that was adjacent to yes. That was leaning that direction without quite committing. Brenna knew better than to push it. She picked up her water bucket and went back to the kitchen garden, and she let Doris stand in the bowl and look at everything and come to her own conclusions at her own pace. Harold came over and pulled on Brenna's sleeve. Is that your goat? He demanded. Yes. She let me sit with her. She doesn't do that for everyone. She must like you. Harold considered this information with the seriousness of a 7-year-old receiving important news. Can I help feed them? You can help feed them every day if you live here. He looked up at her. Are we going to live here? Ask your mother. He ran back to Doris. Brenna heard his voice and then Doris's voice, lower, and then Harold's again, insistent in the way that only young children can be insistent. She kept watering the garden, working along the row, not listening hard enough to make out words. After a while, Doris came over. All right, she said. That was it. Just that. But the way she said it, with her back straight and her chin up and her voice steady, it sounded less like resignation and more like a decision, which is what it was. They moved Doris and the children in over 2 weeks in early June. It was a complicated, exhausting process involving the milk cow, a borrowed wagon from Tom Greer, 3 loads of household goods that turned out to be more than Brenna had room for, and a negotiation with the cow, whose name was Agnes, about whether she was willing to make the final approach up the trail on foot. Agnes was not initially willing. Eventually, Agnes was persuaded. Nobody was at their best by the end of it, but they got there. The first morning, all 4 of them woke up at Iron Hollow Ridge together. Brenna was out before dawn checking the garden. She heard the cabin door open behind her, and Doris came out with 2 cups of coffee. She'd brought real coffee, actual ground coffee, which Brenna hadn't tasted in 8 months, and handed one over without ceremony. They stood side by side in the early light, looking at the bowl. The goats were moving along the south wall. The chickens were starting their morning noise from inside the cave. The kitchen garden was coming in thick and dark green, and behind them the cave held everything it had always held. Steady temperature, clean water, growing things. It's real, Doris said. It's real. I kept thinking, riding up here. I kept thinking it wouldn't be, that it would be a good story someone was telling. She sipped her coffee. But it's real. Brenna looked at the ridge above them, the long spine of rock that had been worthless before it was hers, before she understood what it already was and built from there. The thing about this place was that it hadn't changed, not in any fundamental way. The cave was the same cave that had been here before anyone walked through its entrance. The spring was the same spring that had been running through that channel since before anyone alive could remember. The bats had been roosting in those deep passages for longer than the county had existed. What had changed was the understanding of it. And the understanding had only been possible because she'd come here with nothing and had to pay attention to everything. She thought about what she'd told the Sutters in Tom Greer's back room, that the land will tell you what it wants to hold if you watch long enough before you build. She believed it still, but she understood now that the corollary was also true. You had to be desperate enough to watch. You had to be stripped down far enough that you couldn't afford to see only what you expected to see. Comfort lets you look past things. Necessity makes you look at them. She'd come here with $17, 2 silver coins from a woman who had nothing to spare, and a deed everyone called worthless. She'd been forced to look at everything, really look, because she couldn't afford not to. And what she'd found, underneath all the rock and difficulty and other people's dismissal, was something that had been waiting to be found by someone patient enough and honest enough and desperate enough to find it. That wasn't a lesson she'd planned to learn. Most of the real ones aren't. Summer came on gradually, the way it does at elevation, slowly, testing its welcome, pulling back once or twice before it committed. The garden beds inside the cave continued producing through the warmest months in a way that amazed even Brenna, who'd planned for it. The outdoor kitchen garden went wild in the June sun. Tomatoes from seeds she'd gotten from Helen Pruitt in trade for a season's worth of consulting, beans, squash, a patch of corn that was never going to be her best work, but was real corn regardless. Cord Vickers stopped in twice over the summer. He was different with her now. Not deferential exactly, but honest in a way he hadn't been before. He brought 2 other trappers the second time, men who were looking at territory further north and wanted to know about winter preparation at elevation. Brenna talked to them for 2 hours at the table Doris had helped her build for the kitchen, a real table, flat-topped and stable, with 4 chairs. And she charged them for her time, and they paid it without argument. Ray Holt sent a letter in July. He'd put in raised beds on his bottomland farm. 3 of them, stone-framed, with a drainage system he'd modified from what she'd described. He said 2 of the 3 were performing better than his surface beds. He asked about the bat guano and whether he could find a natural substitute if he didn't have access to a cave system. She wrote back 3 pages. The water rights agreement with Burrell went into effect in August. His cattle used the spring access 3 days a week for specified hours, and on the 1st of each month, Pete came up the trail with the payment, cash, her preference, exactly the agreed amount. He was always on time. Brenna kept a written log of every access date and duration in a ledger she'd bought from Tom Greer because she'd learned that with Burrell, documents mattered. She didn't trust him entirely. She wasn't sure she ever would. But trust and a workable arrangement weren't the same thing, and she'd stopped needing them to be. In September, Harold started school. He walked the 4 miles to Harlan Falls with Pete's younger brother, who was also 7 and also starting the fall term. And the unlikely pairing of those 2 boys, one the son of a dispossessed farm widow, one the son of a ranch hand who worked for the most powerful rancher in the county, became, as far as Brenna could tell, a genuine friendship. She thought there was something worth thinking about in that. She was standing outside the cabin one evening in late September, doing nothing in particular, just standing, which was something she'd gotten better at over the year, the ability to stop and be in a place without immediately finding something to fix, when Doris came out and stood beside her. The bowl was in shadow, the ridge above catching the last of the sun, and the aspens along the west wall were turning, yellow and gold, shaking in the light wind, dropping leaves that landed on the snow-pale ground below and lay there, bright as coins. "You're not what I expected," Doris said. "What did you expect?" "I expected, I don't know, someone harder, after everything." She looked at Brenna sideways. "But you're not hard. You're just steady." Brenna thought about that. "I think there's a difference," she said finally, "between being hard and being decided. Hard is when you've stopped feeling things. Decided is when you feel them and do what needs doing anyway." She watched a leaf come down from the aspens, spinning slow. "I learned that from a winter, and from a cave. and from a grandmother I didn't pay enough attention to when she was alive." Doris nodded. Not because she fully agreed with the framing, Brenna thought, but because she recognized something true in it from her own experience. They stood there until the light went off the ridge entirely, and the bowl went fully dark. And then they went inside, where the fire was going and the lamp was lit, and the sound of Harold recounting his school day in relentless detail filled the small cabin with the specific warm noise of a life being lived. Brenna sat down at the table and opened her ledger. She had numbers to update, plans to record, a letter to Hartwell thanking him for something she'd only recently understood fully, not just the survey but the date on it. The prior claim. The proof that she'd been here, working, before anyone tried to tell a different story about what this land was. That was the thing she was coming to understand, about building something yourself from nothing. The record of it was in the thing itself. Every crooked log she'd notched alone. Every clay pot she'd fired in a fireplace that wasn't drawing right. Every garden bed she'd framed in the dark, with her hands covered in bat droppings, and her back screaming, and her grandmother's voice in her head saying that good soil doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from what you're willing to put into it. The land remembered. That was what she'd learned. The land held the record of every hand that had worked it and every mind that had bothered to understand it before they worked it. She'd been 18 years old, standing in a county clerk's office with a deed everyone called worthless, and she'd made a decision that felt less like courage at the time and more like the absence of any other option she could live with. She hadn't known what she was doing. She'd figured it out as she went, badly and then less badly and then well enough. And she was still figuring it out, and she expected she would be for a long time. That was fine. That was how it worked, for anyone doing anything real. She closed the ledger, capped the ink, and looked around the cabin. At Doris mending a torn goat harness by lamplight. At Harold's slate board propped against the wall with a sum chalked on it that he hadn't gotten right yet, but would by morning, at the cave entrance behind the canvas curtain where green things were growing in the dark, and would go on growing regardless of what winter said. Iron Hollow Ridge, her name on a deed, her hands in the work. The future was not something she was waiting for anymore. It was something she was already in the middle of making, one day at a time, in a place everyone else had given up on, which she'd come to believe was exactly where the best things usually started.